Jordanville Readings, a podcast of Holy Trinity Publications, located at Holy Trinity Monastery in Jordanville, New York. The reading is from Ordinary Wonders, Stories of Unexpected Grace, by Alessia Nikolaeva. Through the prayers of our Holy Fathers, O Lord Jesus Christ our God, have mercy on us. Amen. Augustine. I've already written an entire poem about this, and the abbot of Sretinsky Monastery, Bishop Tikhon, who was one of the players in this story, wrote about it in his memoirs. Nonetheless, I would like to return to the subject once more and tell it how I witnessed it. Once, I came to my father confessor in the monastery. He saw me and was dismayed. "What? You're here? I've just sent a young monk to see you. He is an ascetic from the Caucasus Mountains. Please help him. He doesn't have a passport, and without any documents they won't take him into the monastery. He's already been to the Lavra, and then he wanted to stay here, but there's no way. Think of some way to make him legal. His name is Augustine. He's a person with a very developed spiritual life. I myself asked to be remembered in his anchorite prayers." The word of my father confessor was law to me, so I returned home to save this young monk. I arrived to see him already sitting in our kitchen, drinking tea with my children, surrounded by several men in cassocks, priests and hieromonks, awaiting his stories about the ascetics of the Caucasus Mountains. This was his story. When he was 7 years old, he was sent from Moscow with his mother to the Caucasus Mountains, where they began their ascetic journey under the direction of a certain ascetic elder. This elder tonsured the mother, then tonsured the boy, and they lived under God's protection, in fervent prayer, and by the work of their hands. They planted a garden, kept bees, had goats, cows, and even cats. When Augustine turned 16, and it was high time for him to get his passport, the elder didn't give his blessing, and said that he himself had destroyed his own passport, a document of the Antichrist, a long time ago. Then Augustine's mother also destroyed hers. She just took it and burned it. This was the tradition among the Caucasus ascetics, for they saw in the hammer and sickle inscribed Soviet passport the mark of the Antichrist. The elders soon peacefully reposed in the Lord, and they remained completely alone, but continued to live as they had in the elder's presence, by prayers, fasting, and work. The problem was that no matter how precipitous were the paths leading to their humble cells, they still came across certain wandering monks, pilgrims, hunters, vagabonds, and criminals there. They were also susceptible to cutthroats, Islamicized Greeks who would steal a goat or a jar of honey or take off with all the potatoes. And suddenly the following tragic story took place. One of these Greeks was shot, and it was suspected that the murderer was a hunter who at times stopped by the hut of Augustine and his mother. There the other Greeks went in order to catch him and kill him, but he had already gone somewhere else on his own. Augustine was fixing a bridge over a ravine, and his mother was alone. They began to torture her to find out where the hunter went and where he would return, and even threatened to rape her if she didn't tell them. The old nun was so shaken by their threats that she cried out, "Better burn me alive than to do that to me." And so one of them poked her with a burning torch, apparently as a warning, because when she suddenly caught on fire, they got scared and tried to extinguish the fire. But as she had many layers wrapped around and around her, her cassock, ryasa, the fire grew in intensity, and there was no water nearby, so they ran away in terror. Augustine sensed that something was wrong. A distinct and nagging thought led him to abandon his unfinished work and return home. He saw from a distance the 4 criminals hurriedly descending the path leading from the hut and recognized the evildoers. But they also noticed him. He found his mother still alive. She was writhing on the floor near death, but she managed to bless him and order him to flee that place. This was a true story. I not only heard it from Augustine in my kitchen, but I also read about it in the book In the Caucasus Mountains. And so he buried his mother, came down from the mountains, set off for Sukhumi, and went straight to the church, where some nuns that he knew were laboring. He lived with them for several days, and then they told him, "It's not safe for you to stay here. They're looking for you. Several severe-looking men have already come here, and were studying you and asking about you. Here is some money for you. Go to the Holy Trinity Lavra of St. Sergius. There are still elders there to this very day. He did as they told him. He arrived at the Lavra, came to Elder Kirill and Elder Naum, and they said to him, "They won't admit you here to the monastery without a passport. The authorities watch us like hawks. Go to the Pskov Caves monastery. They are more lax there. Maybe they will take you." He did so. He studied with one of Pecheri elders and my father confessor, and met some of the other monks. The elder tried to talk to the father superior about him, this and that, such a kind novice, no passport. But the father superior, at that time it was Archimandrite Gabriel, categorically refused. What could he do? My father confessor felt sorry for him and sent him to Moscow to us. Perhaps we could think of something in our capital city. And so, when Augustine got settled in our home, a multitude of believers began to throng to him as an ascetic from the Caucasus Mountains. There were among them monks from the Lavra, Moscow priests, and simply zealous laypeople longing for the angelic life. The future abbot of the Sretinsky monastery in Moscow, Bishop Tikhon, who was then Gosha Shevkunov, was also in their number. Everyone wanted to hear Augustine's stories of asceticism, draw near to his holy life, and partake in his grace. The humble monk talked to them and told them everything, lifting his pure dove-like eyes to the pious and grateful listeners. However, it was time to do something for him in return. The simplest way would be to go straight to the police and explain everything. Here was so-and-so, who lived as a monk in the mountainous desert, where no passports are issued, which is why he never got one. So let's fix the situation. If we have to pay a fee, we'll pay a fee. But this plan was soon nixed. It was still Soviet times, and the authorities hunted for monks who lived without passports in the impassable and inaccessible Caucasus Mountains. You had to know the paths in order to find your way there, and no one had the desire to enlighten the police in this matter. So, even if Augustine had gone and surrendered himself, they would have forced him to reveal these secret pathways and show them where all the elders lived. Moreover, he was already 20 years old, and as such was in danger of criminal charges for breaking passport laws and evading military service, and could even possibly be drafted into the army, but as a monk he could not fulfill his military duty by bearing arms. So that meant going to the police was no longer an option, at least by simply walking in. But perhaps we could try to approach it from another angle, i.e., through a connection. The only person in our acquaintance who had a connection with the Ministry of Internal Affairs was the famous mystery novelist Arkady Weiner. He had worked for the Moscow Criminal Intelligence before becoming a writer. He was my neighbor, one entrance over, was friends with my parents, and liked my poetry. I went to see him. He listened to me with obvious interest. He had apparently never dealt with such subjects before. Ascetics, hermits, hunters, Islamicized Greeks. It was all so exotic. But in the end he firmly said, "No, he mustn't turn himself in under any circumstances. He will be of interest to not only the police but the committee members also. They're going to reopen all the cold cases from the Caucasus. You know how many unsolved cases they have in connection with that area. And they'll definitely find something to pin on him. You can try to go the psychiatric route. He lost his memory, his mother died, now he can't remember who, what, where, or how. They'll hold on to him for a while, then they'll release him after fixing his passport. Of course it would be good to find a psychiatrist among your acquaintances, so that he could oversee the entire matter. Otherwise they'll shoot him up and inject him with all sorts of drugs, and he will lose his memory for sure, along with any reasoning." I did have one such psychiatrist in mind, a beacon of psychiatry who had written his dissertation on the psychological rehabilitation of astronauts. He conducted himself, even looked like, a character from a popular joke. He was constantly scratching himself, spitting, snorting, whistling, grunting, stammering, and even occasionally crossing his eyes. When he heard the story of Augustine, and the idea of the famous mystery novelist to claim memory loss, he immediately rejected the plan. They administer such tests there now that he'll give up all the information whether he wants to or not. Then what? They'll sink their claws into him like a tasty treat and start tearing him to shreds. Look at it like this. He is a person who grew up in naturally antisocial circumstances, without a whiff of the Soviet regime or school of thought. Like Mowgli, let's say. My colleagues will start examining him, writing dissertations on him, victimizing him to death, and then diagnose him with religious delusion. No, you can't send him to the psychiatrists under any circumstance. All right, then perhaps some person of high rank and importance could help us out, someone with access to the top. He could write some sort of request. I am asking for an exception to be made in view of my service to the fatherland. To whom could I personally appeal with such a request? Alla Pugacheva? Bulat Okujava? The astronaut Sevastyanov? The sports commentator Nikolai Ozerov, who lived the floor immediately below us? Hero of the Soviet Union Heinrich Hoffmann? Muslim Magomayev? Or better, Yevtushenka. He had been a patron in the past, always signing any petitions that I brought to him. Let him defend a poor monk this time. So I called Yevgeny Alexandrovich, by some miracle reaching him in Moscow. He had just returned from somewhere and was supposed to leave somewhere else at any moment. And this evening, his only evening here, he had a meeting planned with the renowned English writer Graham Greene in the banquet hall of the Central House of Writers. So that's where I went. I sat down right in between the two of them and began a spontaneous conversation with them. By the way, I had read Graham Greene back in school, and so I felt it in my right to just sit down like that without an invitation next to the renowned English author. I was a reader of his, after all. Finally, Yevtushenka asked, "Well, what do you have that's so urgent?" I told him everything. "All right," he responded. I think he even liked that I had appealed to him on such a daring subject. "But officially, nothing will come out of it. You exaggerate my abilities." "Then let's try the option with the false passport," I offered. "It can't be that you, an actual poet, don't know the right people." "Then let's try the option with the false passport," I offered. "It can't be that you, a national poet, don't know the right people." Flattered, he even blushed a little. "Fine," he said, glancing to the side almost conspiratorially. He covered his mouth with his fingers and mumbled through the cracks. "I'll put you in touch with my chauffeur. Perhaps he can come up with something." "Bring me a passport under any man's name. It doesn't matter whose, and a photograph of your guy," nodded the chauffeur. "I'll give it to the proper parties. They'll take off the existing photograph and attach the new one, then forge the seal." "And that's all?" "That's all." "And where am I supposed to get this passport under any man's name?" He shrugged. "That's your business. I don't know. Steal it from somebody." I began to rack my brains to think whose passport I could steal, and do so with the least possible consequences for the owner, when the plan for Augustine's salvation changed. The future abbot of Sretinsky Monastery, Bishop Tikhon, then simply Gosha, was friends with Zurab Chevchavdze, a relative of the Catholicos Patriarch of all Georgia, Ilya. He offered to take Augustine to the Patriarch personally. After all, the Caucasus Mountains were under his canonical jurisdiction, and he could help with issuing a passport for the humble monk without any further questions. This plan was unanimously accepted by all persons involved in Augustine's fate, and Augustine himself was supposed to depart in the near future together with Zurab and Gosha to Tbilisi. Only days remained until the salvation of Augustine would be secured. His departure, however, was put off for a while for technical reasons. Gosha, who worked at the time for the publications department of the Moscow Patriarchate and stood at the fountainhead of Orthodox cinema, was appropriately shooting a film about Russia and Georgia, Orthodox sister countries, of which Russia represented bread and Georgia represented wine, which came together in the mystery of the Eucharist and became the body and blood of Christ. He was planning to shoot the section about wine in Georgia, but it was too late to film the Russian bread, i.e. stalks of wheat. The harvest had already been gathered. The only place where the wheat had not yet been harvested was in the Omsk diocese. It was imperative to go there right away or they would miss the opportunity as well. Nothing but a snowy field would be left. So Gosha flew there. In the meantime, the uncertainty and anticipation was eating away at Augustine, who became more and more distressed. It increasingly seemed to him that he was being driven into a corner from every side. I expressed my surprise at his uncertainty in reading the Psalter, for example, when his reading of the 6 Psalms was smooth as butter. Or when my husband became perplexed that, in spite of his spending the first 7 years of his life in Moscow, he didn't remember either any street names or any metro stations. Moreover, we couldn't understand why he spoke with a Rostov accent. That upset Augustine, but my husband came to his rescue himself. "Perhaps your elder spoke with that accent." Was he from the south of Russia originally? Yes, yes, said the other happily. That's exactly where he was from. And I simply mimicked him. He was from the Rostov area. Then our friend, a hieromonk from the Lavra, a future archbishop, who visited us in order to hear the stories of asceticism, began to share his suspicions with us. What if this Augustine was actually an errand boy sent in an operation by the Secret Service to find out if the church had any channels for preparing false passports? All of these vibes filled the air, and even Augustine felt into an agitated, depressed state and hung out on the balcony all day, which he was categorically forbidden to do. He could have been observed in his cassock. Then somebody could come by and ask, "Who is that? What kind of priest is he? Your documents, please?" Our house was, after all, under special observation, because across from us lived the political refugee Louis Corvalon, and in our immediate proximity was located the window of a Greek billionaire's daughter, Christina Onassis, who had married a Soviet citizen. Not only did Augustine hang out on the balcony, but he also loudly commented on the passer-by. He saw a young woman in white trousers in the neighboring entryway and barked, "What a cow!" He looked into the unshuttered window of an American millionaire's daughter and yelled, "How shameless! She's walking around naked!" He also noticed a certain love triangle unfolding right underneath our balcony. A bald man would roll up to the entry doors in his car and let a young girl out. They would kiss and he would drive off. As soon as he was out of sight, a young guy would appear on his motorcycle. The same girl would give him a kiss on the cheek, jump onto his motorcycle, and they would disappear in a trail of dust until the middle of the night. Then the next day the bald man would again drive up in his car, and the girl, as if nothing was going on, as if there was no such man on the motorcycle, would hop into his car. These womanly wiles tormented Augustine. He would wear himself out standing guard on the balcony. He even began to throw clumps of soil from the flower pots onto the girl so that she would come to her senses. And who knows what our monk, outraged to the core, would have decided to do next, had not my husband distracted him from the matter. For he decided, while there is still time to drive Augustine to a pious elder. This would allow him to be spiritually strengthened for the upcoming journey, to pray, confess to him, receive his blessing, and set off for his new life with renewed strength. Elder Seraphim Tiapochkin had, alas, already passed away, but his spiritual father, also an elder, Schema Archimandrite Grigori, lived in that same Belgorod diocese, in the village of Pokrovka. At one time in the past, my husband, then just Volodya, had gone to Pokrovka. Our father confessor had painted the frescoes in the church there. My husband had gone to visit him there, but there was nobody in the church, and he walked into the priest's house. It was empty. Then he went through the innermost room, assuming that someone might be there, but he didn't see anyone there either. He was about to turn to leave when he heard, "Father Vladimir, what are you doing, walking in like that without saying a prayer?" He looked around and suddenly saw a little dried-up old man sitting on the couch. It was Schema Archimandrite Grigori. My husband decided that he had called him father in some sort of spiritual delusion, but he was astounded and baffled by the fact that he had called him by his name upon seeing him for the first time. So he and Augustine went to this wonderful elder Grigori. They arrived, and my husband said, "Here, Father Grigori, I've brought you a monk. He came down from the Caucasus Mountains, where it's not the custom for them to have Soviet documents. But here a passport is needed everywhere, and they won't even take him into a monastery without it." The elder looked at Augustine and simply waved his hand. "He's no monk." Augustine smiled uneasily and became nervous, but my husband simply assumed that the elder had spoken in that way out of monastic etiquette. Well, in the lives of the saints, for example, this happened to the desert dwellers. Let's say that a father of great spiritual stature was dying, and he would say to himself, "I'm no monk. I haven't even gotten started." So the elder was humbling Augustine in the same manner. He knew better than anyone how best to discipline a young monk. Then Father Grigori added, "He doesn't observe the monastic oath. He doesn't keep the monastic rule. He's an impostor, that's what. He threw someone else's cassock onto himself, pulled on someone else's rasa. There, you have it." My husband nodded knowingly, but Augustine squirmed where he stood. "Well, we're thinking of sending him to the Georgian Patriarch. Give us your blessing to do this," my husband entreated him. "To the Georgian Patriarch?" The elder was amazed. Why on earth would he give himself up to the patriarch? It's useless. It wouldn't work? Asked my husband in fear. Useless! The elder waved his hand again. What are we to do? Don't waste your time. Hand him over to the police and have done with it. When you leave Pokrovka for Belgorod, the first policeman you see, go ahead and hand over your monk to him. Well, thought my husband, the elder's gone mad. But they'll throw him in prison. All the better. Father Grigori nodded his head in approval. Good riddance. Shocked, my husband did not, of course, hand Augustine over to any policeman, but brought him back safe and sound to our house in Moscow. But he remained deeply concerned. In the meantime, the future abbot of Sretinsky Monastery, still Gosha at the time, had successfully, if belatedly, filmed the fields of wheat and was now on his way to the airport to fly to Moscow, accompanied by the subdeacon of the Bishop of Omsk. The flight was delayed, and the young subdeacon was noticeably unsure of whether or not to leave the Moscow guest, to whom his bishop had assigned him, on his own. So, walking within the departures area, they came up to a fateful desk on which was written the word, Wanted. It was accompanied by photographs of criminals. By the way, the subdeacon suddenly livened up, seizing the opportunity to start a conversation. There was a con artist here. He set himself up to work as a reader in our church, and then robbed both the church and the priest who had taken him in. He took the gospel in its cover with precious stones, the censer, money from the church collection box, the priest's cassock and documents, his passport, birth certificate, seminary diploma. Recently, one of our people saw him in the Lavra itself. He was apparently walking around there in a cassock and passing himself off as Monk Augustine. What wonders! That day, we had gathered together to see Augustine off. Zurab Chavchavtse came, and we were waiting for Gosha, who had just arrived from Omsk. He came, looking very mysterious, and right away took off with my husband to the store. Let's go buy something. There's nothing to eat here. We have everything we need. Why? He led him away. It turned out to be a maneuver. He just wanted to tell him everything that he had discovered without raising Augustine's suspicions. We need to take him away from the house under some plausible pretext and search his things. My husband called our friend, a higher monk from the Lavra, a future archbishop, and asked his help. He had the monastery car and was able to come fairly quickly. He immediately understood his task. I've been asked to examine some icons, to check if they're genuinely old or a forgery. Do you want to come with me? He asked Augustine, and they left together. In the meantime, we dug through the belongings of our monk and, sure enough, found the stolen passport of the Omsk priest, his birth certificate, diploma, cross, gospel, and its valuable cover. In short, the thief had been discovered and caught red-handed. When the future archbishop returned, the future abbot of Sretinsky Monastery called everyone together in the room, locked the door, and began his speech so intriguingly, with such dramatic flair and masterful presentation of the storyline, that he created a perfect atmosphere for the moment of truth and the promise of exposure and catharsis. Augustine sat, tense and red in the face. Well, now it's your turn to tell us everything, Sirosha. The future bishop turned to him. It turned out that he was not a monk, and not named Augustine. It was simply called Sirosha. He had served in the army and worked in the storage depot, and the military instructor who was his supervisor was a thief. Suddenly an inspection was announced, so Sirosha got scared and ran away. He was serving somewhere in the south of Russia. Where could he go? It was clear that he had to go as far away as possible, into the mountains. There he met a pilgrim, and together they reached the elders in the Caucasus, where a young novice was also laboring with them. So he took the latter's story for himself. The only difference was that the novice was called Daniil, not Augustine. I have already mentioned that the book In the Caucasus Mountains had recently come out, in which you could read about both Daniil and his mother set on fire by the criminals. So the story itself was, I repeat, true. Only Augustine, who had adopted the story for himself, was a fake. Sirosha lived there with the monks, and grew to love them very much after living with them, but nevertheless they asked him to leave them. He didn't like to work, talk too much, eat with a healthy appetite, and was, in general, of another spirit. In short, he was a burden to them. They gave him a letter to the nuns of Sukhumi Church. They bought him a ticket, and he reached Omsk and immediately went to the church. The priest there took him in as his acolyte and gave him a place to live, while the local bishop promised to help him obtain a passport. Seroja had told him that his passport had been stolen. Then he conjured him a reader. But a singer in that church, who developed a passionate attraction to the young acolyte, ruined everything. She would attach herself to him, grab him by the hand, give him presents. Seroja would simply give away her presents, either to the priest or to the other singers. This was discovered, and she was terribly offended. She backed him up against a wall, against the church enclosure, and when he was shaking out the dust from the carpets there. "Are you going to marry me or not?" He said, "I don't want to marry. I'm going to be a monk." And she began to wail her heart out. At that, the Prosfora baker, the gardener, the warden, the priest himself all jumped out. And she kept tearing her hair and crying out, "He's ruined and defiled me. He promised to fix everything with an honorable marriage. I'm going to have a child from him now, and he's hiding in the bushes. I don't know you," he says, "or your child. He's used me and refused me." The priest was a pure, chaste man, and when he heard these words, his expression darkened. He took Seroja firmly by the elbow and said to him, "Marry her. If you don't, I'll lay such a heavy penance on you, then chase you out of the church as the shameless person that you are. I'll tell the bishop not to give you a passport, too." Everyone stood around him and scolded him for all that he was worth. The girl kept on screaming like mad. Seroja took serious offense. He returned to the cell where he lived in the priest's house and decided to punish them. He took his new cassock and ryasa, took the gospel and its precious cover, took the church censer. Then he realized suddenly he didn't have a cent to his name. He worked in the church for free, lived with the priest with all his expenses paid, and ate in the church refectory. How was he supposed to get anywhere? So we came up with an idea. He wouldn't steal the money, but simply take what he had earned, his hard-earned wages. He entered the church, robbed the collection boxes, left, and that was the last they saw of him. Thereby he continued on his way to the Lavra, but he thought better of bringing the priest's passport into the matter. From the Lavra, as we remember, he was sent to Pechori, and from there to us in Moscow. The future abbot of Sretinsky Monastery drove the skull and goods to Omsk and returned them to the priest, convincing him to withdraw his report to the police. Before leaving, he came to her house and handed the false Augustine a book. "Here, read." The book was Crime and Punishment. Then the future archbishop came to our house and confessed the thief and liar. Afterwards, the latter went to surrender himself to the priest. The only condition that we gave him was the following. He should, under no circumstances, tell them about his time in the Caucasus Mountains. If they asked him where he had been, he should say, in Omsk, in the Lavra, in Pechori, and that most of his time was spent in Moscow, and we would confirm this. Later, we were visited by investigators from the military prosecutor's offices in order to compare findings, but everything matched up. We confirmed that he had really been in hiding in the Caucasus Mountains. He had actually spent that time at our house in Moscow. We spoke in his favor. The investigators admitted that during the course of the investigation, he behaved in an exemplary manner and repeated the entire time that he wanted to become a monk. Even his military command wasn't interested in charging him with desertion. They weren't after his blood. So he was given a short sentence in a penal colony, from which he was then released early on probation for exemplary conduct. He returned to the free world and soon became a monk. When I was serving my sentence, I suffered most from the fact that my cassock had been taken off me, he admitted. I felt like Adam and Eve after the fall, naked. In the meantime, Schema Archimandrite Gavril, who had unmasked him at the first glance, departed for his heavenly dwelling place. Our recently released book, an enormous volume called The Last Russian Elders, finished with a chapter dedicated to him. We pray that you were edified by today's podcast. If you would like to help in the creation of more Jordanville Readings podcasts, consider supporting us on Patreon. As a thank you to our subscribers, we also offer special discounts on our online store. Visit patreon.com/Holy Trinity to set up a monthly donation. May the Lord reward you for your generosity. Jordanville Readings is produced and distributed by Holy Trinity Publications in Jordanville, New York. All rights reserved. For more information about today's reading and our full list of publications, please see the show notes or visit holytrinitypublications.com. Thank you.